Okay, so Tolkien. I mean, everyone knows Tolkien, right?
Mm.
Hobbits, elves, epic battles, all that. But today, we're kind of taking a different path, a different journey, if you will.
Right.
Going deep into Tolkien's life, but through this lens that I think a lot of people kind of miss.
Mm-hmm.
And that is his Catholic faith, which was incredibly important to him.
Yeah, and I think what we're going to find as we kind of unpack this is that it wasn't just like a box he checked on a Sunday morning.
Right.
It really was fundamental to his entire worldview and the
Yeah.
way he saw everything, even down to how he wrote his books.
Totally. And we've got a ton of cool stuff to share with you guys to really bring this side of Tolkien to life, to kind of show how his faith was so deeply intertwined with everything he did.
Absolutely.
So I guess a good place to start is, well, the beginning, right?
Mm.
With his childhood and how his Catholic identity first kind of took root.
Yeah, I think looking at his early life, there were some pretty major events that maybe started to shape his view of, like, God's plan, providence and all that. He was born in South Africa, but his dad died when he was really young.
Oh.
And then when they moved back to England, they faced some serious financial struggles. So I think even then, maybe he started to lean on, a power beyond himself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Like needing someone bigger to rely on when things are tough.
Exactly. And then when Tolkien was 8, his mom, Mabel, converted to Catholicism.
Oh, wow. So he wasn't raised Catholic from the very start.
Nope. And her conversion, it wasn't simple. It actually cost her a lot. Like, her family was totally against it, and they even cut off their financial support because of it.
Oh, wow. So they were really serious at not accepting that.
Yeah, so it shows how strong her conviction was, choosing her faith, even when it meant facing real hardship.
That's huge. It makes you think about what kind of impact that would have on a kid, seeing their mom stand so firm in her beliefs.
For sure. And Mabel, she didn't just convert. She really made sure her sons lived their faith. She taught them catechism, that question and answer way of learning about the faith.
Right.
And she prayed with them, made sure they were devoted to the Eucharist and the Virgin Mary. Even their nature walks, she used those as opportunities to teach them about religion, connecting the beauty of creation back to God.
Wow. So like everywhere they went, everything they saw, it was connected back to their faith.
Yeah, it was woven into their everyday lives.
It makes me think about his idea of subcreation that we hear so much about.
Uh-huh.
That concept of humans being creators, reflecting God's own creativity. It's like those early experiences, seeing nature's beauty while learning about God, planted the seeds for that idea, for humans participating in creation in a way that reflects the divine.
That's a really interesting connection. I hadn't thought about it like that before. And Mabel's influence, it even extended to her death. She had diabetes, which back then was basically a death sentence.
Oh, wow.
And she offered up all her suffering for her sons so they would stay strong in their Catholic faith.
Oh, my gosh.
Tolkien himself later talked about how much her sacrifice meant to him.
That's incredibly powerful. It's like a final act of love and devotion. And you can definitely see how that would instill in him a real sense of duty to the church.
Right, like an obligation to honor her sacrifice by living out his faith.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And then, after his mom passed, another really important person came into his life, Father Francis Morgan.
Yeah, Father Morgan was appointed as their guardian. Now, he was a priest at the Birmingham Oratory,
Okay.
which, if you remember, was founded by, none other than John Henry Newman.
Oh, right. That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it's huge. And Newman was all about this harmony between faith and reason.
I can see how that would appeal to Tolkien.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
And Father Morgan, he really provided that for Tolkien. Not just care and stability, but this whole intellectual foundation rooted in Catholic thought, very much in line with Newman's ideas.
So kind of picking up where Mabel left off, but on the intellectual side of things.
Precisely. And it was under Father Morgan's guidance that Tolkien really got immersed in Catholic tradition. He developed this deep love for the Latin Mass, which, as we'll see, stayed with him. And I think it's important to remember, he's a teenager at this point. He's lost both his parents.
Right.
His faith wasn't just some abstract idea, it was his anchor. It gave him meaning and hope when he was dealing with such a tough time.
Absolutely. That feeling of being rooted in something bigger than yourself when everything else feels uncertain.
Exactly. He went to daily mass, had this deep reverence for the Eucharist. It wasn't just going through the motions for him, it was vital.
Like a lifeline.
Yeah, exactly. And even his interest in mythology, which started around this time at King Edward's School, he saw it through this Catholic lens.
Oh, interesting. So he wasn't just like, oh, cool stories.
No, not at all. He saw these ancient myths as potential glimpses of something deeper, maybe even echoes of divine truth.
That's fascinating because you think of mythology and it's all about, gods and monsters and stuff. But he saw something more in it.
Yeah, he saw the possibility of those stories pointing to something real, something beyond the literal events.
I've always been intrigued by that idea, of myths as these sort of veiled reflections of truth.
It's a powerful concept for sure. And it really prefigures his whole approach to storytelling, how he uses fantasy to explore deeper truths.
Right. And I think it's worth mentioning that in his close group of friends, the TCBS, he was the only Catholic.
Yeah, and that's interesting because instead of, maybe making him question his faith, it seems like it actually made his convictions stronger.
Like he had to really own his beliefs when he was surrounded by people who didn't share them.
Exactly. And later on in his letters, he actually refers to the Catholic Church as the one true church. It's almost like that early experience, being the lone Catholic in his group, solidified that for him.
So to kind of sum up this period of his life, the key takeaways are, well, first, his mom's incredible faith and her sacrifice, which had a huge impact on him.
Right.
And then, of course, Father Morgan stepping in and providing this intellectual and spiritual guidance, really shaping his understanding of Catholicism.
Yeah.
Then there's Tolkien's own deep commitment to his faith, even when he faced real hardship, and how he started to weave those religious themes into his imagination, his love for stories.
Exactly. It all comes together to form this foundation for who he becomes.
Okay, so let's move on to his more formal education. I mean, he obviously loved languages, right?
Yeah.
Latin, Greek, all that stuff.
Yeah, he excelled at King Edward's School, particularly in those areas. But for Tolkien, these weren't just subjects to study.
Right.
They were connected to the church, to the liturgy and prayers. He saw language as a divine gift, this powerful tool for creation and communication.
Which again goes back to his whole idea of subcreation.
Exactly. Humans using this divine gift of language to create within God's creation.
It's like everything circles back to that, doesn't it?
It really does. And his devotion during school was unwavering, too. Daily mass at the Birmingham Oratory, even though it meant traveling quite a distance.
Wow.
And he was serious about his faith, but he wasn't preachy or judgmental, just this quiet, steadfast commitment.
It's like he lived his faith rather than just talked about it.
Precisely. He regularly received the sacraments because for him, they were how God's grace worked in the world. And his fascination with mythology continued to grow, but always viewed through that lens of potential divine truth.
Right. So those myths weren't just entertainment, they were something more.
Yeah, like Newman talked about, they were shadows of the real. And it's around this time that we see the idea of the gospel as the greatest fairy story that's actually true, starting to solidify in his mind.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And then comes Oxford. I imagine that was a pretty different environment.
Oh, for sure. Much more secular, less focused on religion. But Tolkien's faith, it stayed constant. He kept going to daily mass, and he really got into the works of major theological thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas.
Wow, so he wasn't just passively religious. He was really engaging with the intellectual side of his faith.
Absolutely. And Newman's influence continued to be strong, this idea that the Catholic faith answers our deepest longing for truth.
Right, that it's not just about blind faith, but about finding answers to the big questions.
Exactly. And this period at Oxford, it was also when he really started developing his own languages and his mythology.
So the early stages of Middle-earth were taking shape.
Right. And even though it wasn't explicitly religious, you can already see some of those Catholic principles at work. Good versus evil, free will, the importance of grace.
So his faith was informing his creative process, even if he wasn't consciously trying to preach.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about his relationship with Edith Bratt. It wasn't exactly smooth sailing, was it?
No, it wasn't. It's actually quite a story. Didn't Father Morgan tell him he couldn't see her for a while?
He did. He was worried it would distract Tolkien from his studies and his vocation. He actually forbade him from seeing Edith until he was 21.
Wow. That's a long time.
Yeah, it was. But Tolkien, he respected Father Morgan's authority. He obeyed, even though it was probably really hard. It shows how seriously he took his faith, how important it was to him.
To put his faith above his personal desires like that, that's a big deal.
Definitely. But then they did eventually reunite. But there was another obstacle. Edith was engaged to someone else.
Oh, no. What did Tolkien do?
Well, he was determined to win her back. And he did. But there was another crucial element to their story, Edith's faith. She was Anglican,
Right.
and Tolkien was adamant that they had to marry in the Catholic Church. Ultimately, Edith converted, even though her family wasn't happy about it.
Wow, so they both made sacrifices for their faith.
They did. And for Tolkien, marriage wasn't just a romantic thing. It was a sacrament, a vocation, something sacred blessed by God.
I remember in one of his letters to his son Michael, he talks about the Eucharist being at the very center of their married life.
Right. It shows how deeply his faith shaped his understanding of love and commitment, how it wasn't just about feelings, but about something much bigger.
It's like those themes of sacrifice and enduring love that we see in Beren and Luthien, Their story is a reflection of his own journey with Edith.
That's such a great point. The parallels are definitely there.
So we've talked about his childhood, his education, his love for Edith. But then comes World War I.
Yeah, that must have been a huge test of faith. I mean, to see that kind of brutality, the suffering, the evil.
It's hard to imagine how anyone could go through that and not have their faith shaken.
It really is. But even in the trenches, Tolkien clung to his beliefs. Prayer, the rosary, the belief that God was still in control, even amidst the chaos.
So those things became even more important in that environment.
Definitely. They were his anchors. And the loss of his closest friends from the TCBS must have been devastating.
Oh, yeah. I can only imagine.
In his letters to their families, he talks about suffering and hope, and it's so powerful. It really foreshadows the themes he'll explore later in his writing.
It's like those experiences really shaped his understanding of those big questions, those fundamental truths.
Absolutely. And then there's his own illness, the trench fever.
Right.
You could almost see that as providence, It took him out of the fighting, maybe even saved his life, and it gave him the time and space to start working on the Silmarillion.
Wow, that's an interesting way to look at it. So even in the midst of all that darkness, something good came out of it.
Exactly. His faith allowed him to find meaning even in suffering. And then when he went back to teaching, first at Leeds, then Oxford, he was in a pretty secular environment.
Right.
But he continued to live out his faith. And he saw literature as more than just an academic pursuit. He believed it could be a force for good, for moral and spiritual growth.
So, there was a purpose to his work. It wasn't just about entertainment.
Exactly. And his personal devotion remained strong. Daily Mass, often in Latin, confession, the Rosary, devotion to Mary, these were constants in his life. And he raised his children in the church, too.
It's clear that his faith wasn't just a private thing for him. It permeated every aspect of his life.
It truly did. And there's this really powerful quote from a letter he wrote to his son, Michael. He says that the only cure for sagging or fainting faith is communion. The Blessed Sacrament is the one great thing to love on earth.
Wow.
It just shows how central the Eucharist was to his spiritual life, and it really ties into the themes of sacrifice and grace that we see in his writing.
Right, that idea of something greater than ourselves sustaining us, giving us strength.
Absolutely, and that brings us to this whole question of the hidden Catholicism in The Lord of the Rings.
Because it is there, isn't it? Even though he didn't explicitly write a Christian allegory.
Exactly. He himself said it was fundamentally religious and Catholic, and you can see it in the themes.
Yeah.
Providence, sin and redemption, free will, self-sacrificial love.
Right, like the ring representing the corrupting power of sin.
Yes. And Frodo's journey, his struggle to resist the ring, it reflects our need for grace. And even Gollum, there's that possibility of redemption, however flawed it might be.
It's like he's showing us these deep Catholic truths through this incredible story.
And we can't forget Galadriel. She's practically an embodiment of Marian imagery.
Oh, totally. Her beauty, her wisdom, her compassion, the way she guides and comforts Frodo.
Exactly. And even the lembas bread, it's more than just food, right? It sustains them on their journey. It gives them strength.
It's like a Eucharistic symbol,
Yeah.
nourishing both body and soul.
Exactly. And then there's subcreation itself. The very act of creating this whole world, it reflects a deeply Christian understanding of humanity reflecting God's creative power.
It's like Tolkien is saying, look, stories aren't just made-up things. They can point us to truth, to something bigger than ourselves.
Yes. And the gospel itself, the ultimate true story, it's all connected.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper into those Catholic themes. Subcreation, as we've said, it was more than just writing fantasy for Tolkien.
Yeah, it was a theological concept. It came from the idea that humans are made in God's image. So we have this unique ability to create, to reflect God's own creative act.
So for him, it wasn't just about escapism. It was about exploring truth through stories.
Exactly. And when you look at the creation myth in Middle-earth, the Annandale, it's strikingly similar to the Christian understanding of creation.
Right. You have Iluvatar, who's like God, and the music of creation, this beautiful harmony,
Yeah. And then you have Melkor, who introduces discord, who represents evil. But even Melkor isn't creating evil, he's corrupting something that was originally good.
which is basically the Augustinian view of evil.
Right. It's not a separate creation, it's a twisting of what was good.
And that whole battle between good and evil in The Lord of the Rings, it's so complex, but it's ultimately rooted in a Catholic understanding of morality.
Oh, absolutely. While there's nuance, there's still this clear sense of right and wrong. The ring represents the seductive power of sin, and Frodo's struggle to resist it, that's our need for grace. And Gollum's possible redemption, that speaks to God's mercy.
It's like he's showing us these deep truths about the human condition through this epic story.
And even those little hints of unseen forces at work, like what Gandalf says about other powers being involved.
Right, like that quote, there are other forces at work in this world besides the will of evil.
Exactly. It points to providence, to God's plan working behind the scenes. And Frodo ultimately failing to destroy the ring on his own, that shows us how we need God's grace.
We can't do it alone.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have suffering and sacrifice woven throughout the whole story.
Yeah, like Frodo carrying the burden of the ring, Gandalf dying and coming back, Aragorn's journey as king.
It all points to the Christian understanding of Christ's sacrifice, his death and resurrection.
And that idea of redemptive suffering, of suffering having a purpose.
It's so central to Tolkien's worldview. And then there's Galadriel, who, the more you look at her, the more she becomes this Marian figure.
Oh, yeah, totally. Her wisdom, her compassion, the way she represents light in the darkness.
And even Lumba's bread, it's more than just food.
Right. It sustains them on their journey, gives them strength. It's almost like the Eucharist.
Exactly. It nourishes them both physically and spiritually. And this all goes back to Tolkien's understanding that the spiritual and physical worlds are intertwined, which is a fundamentally Catholic view.
So let's talk about his personal life, his family life. I mean, he was devoted to his Catholic practices throughout his life.
Yeah, his daily life was grounded in his faith.
Yeah.
Mass, the Eucharist, confession, these were all essential for him.
And his devotion to Mary, to the Rosary, he saw her as a guiding presence, even said she inspired him in his work.
It's amazing how these beliefs weren't just abstract ideas for him. He lived them out every day. And he raised his children in the faith, teaching them about guardian angels, about the battle between good and evil.
He wanted to make sure they understood the spiritual reality behind the physical world.
Exactly. And when his oldest son, John, became a priest, he was overjoyed.
That must have been a huge moment for him, seeing his son following that path.
Definitely. And in his letters to his sons, he warns them about secularism, about the dangers of losing sight of faith. He constantly emphasizes the church and the sacraments, especially the Eucharist.
It's like he's giving them this roadmap for navigating life's challenges.
Exactly. And then there's his relationship with the Latin Mass. He was very attached to it, and he struggled with the changes after Vatican II.
Yeah, the introduction of the new Mass, the Novus Ordo.
He felt it lacked some of the reverence and solemnity of the Old Mass. He even used to whisper the Latin responses during the English Mass.
Wow.
It shows how deeply connected he was to the tradition, the beauty of the Latin Rite. But he still obeyed the Church, even when he had personal reservations.
That's important, that even though he had those struggles, he remained faithful to the Church.
It shows his respect for authority, even when things were difficult. And even in his final years after Edith died, his faith was his comfort.
Yeah, he clung to that hope of being reunited with her in heaven.
And in his later writings, you can see his longing for the beatific vision, for that direct experience of God. His death, receiving the last rites, his Catholic funeral, it all speaks to a life lived and ended in faith.
And being buried with Edith under the names Baron and Luthien, it's such a beautiful symbol of their love, both earthly and eternal.
It really is. And his legacy, it's incredible. He's this literary giant, and his work, even though it's not explicitly religious, it's infused with his Catholic worldview.
Right, those themes of good versus evil, redemption, grace, they resonate with people even if they don't consciously recognize the Catholic influence.
Exactly. And he's influenced so many other Christian writers, like C.S. Lewis.
And you see this huge Catholic appreciation for Tolkien today. His works are used in education. They offer this alternative to secular fantasy.
And even the Vatican has acknowledged the depth of his work. Pope Benedict XVI spoke very highly of him. And there's even talk, though it's mostly speculation, about a possible cause for canonization.
I mean, he's not officially being considered, but there are definitely people who see him as a model of holiness. His devotion, his integrity, his dedication to his family, his endurance through suffering.
It's all there. He really embodies what it means to live out your faith in the world.
So after this deep dive, it's clear that Tolkien's Catholic faith was absolutely central to who he was, to everything he did.
It wasn't just a side note, it was the foundation of his life and his work.
And I think understanding that really changes how you see his stories.
It adds a whole new layer of meaning to them.
So for all of you listening, the next time you pick up The Lord of the Rings or any of his other works, think about what we've talked about.
Think about how his faith might have shaped those stories, those characters, those themes.
And maybe it'll give you a new appreciation for the depth and richness of his world.
And for the man behind it all.
Thanks for joining us on this fascinating journey.